Saul David Alinsky has been described as the man you invite into your city to bust up the joint. He is an apostle of power.
It becomes a contest of power. I'm willing to go out and get corrupted for it. I'm willing to fight for it. I'm willing to stick my life on a line on it.
Why should Texans in 2024 care about a progressive activist from the 1960s? There's a good chance you've never heard of Saul Alinsky, but without a doubt, you know the name Barack Obama. And Barack Obama revered Alinsky, the Chicago-based community organizer. In fact, according to NPR, he was Obama's inspiration. How about Kamala Harris? The man who made Kamala's career, Willie Brown, was a student of Alinsky's. And Hillary Clinton? She wrote her senior thesis on Alinsky's organizing model. The guy, even though he's long dead, remains a big deal. Alinsky was a progressive's progressive, best known today for writing the book Rules for Radicals, a guide to the dark art of social disruption to drive political change. A key component of his approach is never letting a crisis go to waste. Sometimes, crisis comes from manufactured disruption. Think BLM in 2020 or Russiagate in 2016. However, a crisis can also come about organically, as it did in 2021 when a freak winter storm slammed Texas. Now, radicals in Texas are trying to use the ensuing crisis to strip Texas of its electrical grid. From Texas Scorecard, I'm Daniel Greer, and this is Exposed. Lights out.
If it weren't for renewable energy subsidies, there wouldn't be a single wind turbine in Texas. There wouldn't be a single solar panel. They are so uneconomical.
The whole thing is about charging us more money. The whole thing is about controlling our life and our behaviors. And in terms of the environment, it makes absolutely almost no difference whatsoever.
When you talk about the fragility of our grid, for example, there are 16 or 17 substations that if compromised, our whole grid goes down.
I started seeing the tentacles of China wrapping themselves around countries and strangling them.
In July 2024, Hurricane Beryl wreaked havoc on the Gulf Coast. The hurricane was a Category 1 storm, the weakest possible. But like the 2021 winter storm, hundreds of thousands of Texans were left in the dark again.
Now, a week without power has been a terrible burden on more than 250,000 people in our area.
Well, nearly 2 weeks after Hurricane Beryl slammed into Houston, CenterPoint Energy says it's restored electricity to all of its customers. More than 2 million of them lost power at the peak of the Category 1 storm, which made landfall on July 8th.
Unfortunately for Texans, some politicians want to use disasters like the 2021 winter storm to hijack our state's energy. Democrats in Texas have seized on these crises to gain more control over electricity in the state. Greg Casar, a self-described socialist congressman from Austin, has repeatedly introduced legislation to strip Texas of her independent grid and force her into a nationalized power grid.
We need to interconnect the Texas grid. A recent MIT study showed that by fully interconnecting Texas to the national grids, basically catching up to the 21st century, we could have prevented 80% of the blackouts that we suffered during Winter Storm Uri. We could prevent blackouts that we might be facing in a hot summer like this one.
Casar isn't alone in this effort. Former Democrat congressman and failed candidate for senator, president, and governor, Beto O'Rourke, has called for the same step.
We need to connect ERCOT, which is our grid, with the national grid so that we can draw down power when we need it.
According to Casar and O'Rourke, hooking Texas up to the Western energy grid will allow us to draw power in an emergency. But being connected to either of the two national grids doesn't guarantee that there will be power when we need it most. Ed Hers, an economist and professor at the University of Houston, called this line of thinking a conceit in a 2021 interview. He cites California as an example. The Golden State imports 35% of its daily electricity requirement from other states. When California was recently hit with a heat wave, the same weather impacted Oregon, Washington, Wyoming, and Arizona, the main suppliers of electricity to California. So, when these states needed all their power, there was no excess. Hers calls it a conceit that we don't have to build for peak power. The idea that we can rely on our neighbor was, quote, blown all to heck. If Texas were to hook into another grid, as Conceit and O'Rourke want, when Texas needs power the most, it's likely the other states will need that power too. Actually, in an emergency, it's entirely plausible that they will be taking power from us. So investing to interconnect may not increase resiliency at all. This according to ERCOT's president, Pablo Vegas.
It's not just the reliability question. It's really a question as to whether it would be the most economic way to improve reliability and resiliency by interconnecting the grid to other grids, or would the dollars spent be better served and give us better reliability if we were to invest inside of Texas in additional transmission and other resources to help with reliability and resiliency?
Conceit, O'Rourke, and others advocating for Texas to give up our grid independence are doing so based on a flawed understanding of the frequency of weather happening.
Climate is not weather, and the weather can really fool you.
That was Steve Koonin, the Undersecretary for Science in the U.S. Department of Energy under President Obama. He's the author of Unsettled, a book debunking the claim that the science on climate change is settled. When he was interviewed in 2021, shortly after the winter storm, the executive director of the American Society of Civil Engineers, Thomas Smith, took the opportunity to advocate for a more interconnected grid and approach to infrastructure. His points include claims of massive weather events driving needed changes.
We're going to have a major problem. And this issues like we see in Texas, like we saw earlier in California with blackouts, but like we see in reaction to hurricanes and the increasing storm events that we've seen. And these events, by the way, are getting worse. I mean, we know that. If you look at just the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, over the last year, we had 22 separate billion-dollar storm disaster events. That includes a drought, 13 severe storms, 7 cyclones, a wildfire. That's a number that continues to increase over time. In fact, this 2020 was the 6th consecutive year in which we've had 10 or more of these separate billion-dollar weather and climate disaster events. So we have to start thinking a little bit differently.
Koonin contends, based on data, that conclusions like Smith's aren't rooted in scientific observation. In a Hoover Institute talk, Koonin covered trends in hurricanes over the past 50 years. The upshot? The experts don't see any trends in hurricane severity.
And this is a record that extends over 50-some-odd years. It's hard to see any change at all. And in fact, the official reports say we can't find any trends.
There is no trend in either direction, much less increased severity. And it's not just shared weather events that could leave Texas in the dark. In the past, a cascading failure occurred when a tree fell on an electrical line in Cleveland, knocking out large swaths of the Atlantic seaboard. A number of years ago, an operator in a power station in Arizona flipped a switch, and Southern California went down. According to Ed Hers, the more interconnected we are, the more opportunities there are for failures. So this utopic vision that Conceit and O'Rourke are hyping is not safe and leads to increased vulnerability. The plan seems less about reliability and more about control. Specifically, policing how Texas makes energy with coal and natural gas. Here's Congressman Chip Roy.
It's about control. All of this is about control. If you really believed the garbage that's being spewed out about all of the climate hysteria, we would have hundreds of new nuclear power plants.
Jason Isaac, an expert with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, warns that more government control would likely end reliable energy production via coal and natural gas in Texas.
But the last thing we want to do is connect any other grids, because that's going to bring us immediately into regulation under the under FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And the first thing they would do is to start shutting down coal and natural gas generated electricity. I mean, they're trying to do that around the country and other grids that are regulated by FERC, but that's the last thing we want to do in Texas.
Moving on to another grid would expedite and exacerbate what's been happening in Texas for over a decade. Over that time, we've been ditching reliable methods of producing electricity. Right now, Texas creates energy with a handful of methods, the largest being coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, wind, and solar. And as we noted in episode 1 of this podcast, all methods of generation except for wind and solar are down over the past decade.
Keep in mind that the amount of natural gas, coal, and nuclear and hydro generation is down over the last 12 years.
Texas currently manages its electric grid, meaning we have a great deal of independence. Congressman Randy Weber described the benefits of this setup during a congressional hearing.
One of the things that makes Texas unique is our islanded grid, and it's my understanding that this allows Texas to respond more quickly to cyber and physical cyber attacks, physical threats, physical events, since they actually operate under one set of regulations, state of Texas, and of course they're accountable not to FERC, but to the agency in Texas.
Instead of building reliable energy generation, Texas is poised to continue growing its reliance on unreliable green energy in the coming years. Again, we'll hear from Congressman Roy.
Do I think the state of Texas ought to be active in ensuring that the grid in Texas is strong and secure? Yes. Do I think Texas ought to be active through the AG's office in Paxton and suing the federal government, trying to stop the burdensome regulations? Absolutely. But the people of Texas ought to be demanding of Austin, demanding of our state leaders, that they make Texas strong.
Texas State Senator Bob Hall, an electrical engineer himself, has been a leader at the state level in working to secure and strengthen Texas grid. He blames onerous environmental regulations for the issues Texas is experiencing in 2024.
The environmentalists had just about destroyed Texas' ability to produce reliable electricity because we had to shut down dozens of coal-fired plants because of environmental rules, which took away a huge amount of capacity. And then the environmentalists also limited our gas-fired plants. It does not let them operate at maximum capacity. And so we have been strangled on reliable energy because wind and solar are unreliable. Or you can describe them as dispatchable and non-dispatchable.
Senator Hall and other specialists we'll hear from in this series will use terms unique to the electricity generation world, in this case, dispatchable and non-dispatchable. These terms describe different types of electricity. The simplest way to think about dispatchable energy is it's reliable and comes from sources that can be ramped up quickly. Gas, coal, and nuclear all fall into this category because we control the resources needed to create the power. Non-dispatchable energy is unreliable, meaning we don't control it. Examples of non-dispatchable energy are solar and wind. We don't control weather events that may stop both from working.
We have got to make sure that we've got reliable power in Texas.
But we do. We need more coal, we need more natural gas, and we need more nuclear in this state if we're going to fend off the threat of deindustrialization.
This is a place where two strands connect. Linking up with grids, as Kassar and O'Rourke advocate, may result in Texas losing even more reliable energy sources. Jason Isaac talks about how this played out in California and impacted neighboring states.
But yeah, you look at what's happened in California. California is, had all these long-term commitments to buy electricity from its surrounding states. Then they start passing all these policies. The surrounding states are then paying higher for electricity because of policies pushed in California. And now California is canceling contracts with some coal-fired generation. So, and now these plants don't have the revenue that they once had, and so some of them are shuttering.
Such a setup would add insult to injury. Voters will be disenfranchised and have less power.
That's going to result in higher costs, not only for people in California, but the surrounding states that are in that grid as well. And the last time I checked, people in Utah and Nevada didn't elect people in California, but they are certainly feeling the ramifications of those people being elected and impacting their energy policy.
When California hooked its grid up to neighboring states, it had contracts with coal-fired plants, which it then canceled. These canceled contracts not only led to less energy, but also raised prices for Californians and consumers in other states. Texas lawmakers appear to understand the need to level the playing field between dispatchable and non-dispatchable energy. Here's Isaac again.
Governor Abbott had a beautiful directive in 2021 on July 6th that says that there needs to be a reliability requirement and that wind and solar should bear the cost of their unreliability. Because right now, consumers are bearing that cost, and it's billions of dollars a year.
In 2018, before Texas experienced widespread blackouts during the 2021 winter storm, the Trump administration was working to intervene and forestall the closures of coal plants nationwide. Texas Democrat Congressman Mark Vesey took time during a congressional hearing to chastise the administration's plans after they were leaked.
It detailed a plan to direct the Energy Secretary, also from Texas, to use authorities vested in him from the Federal Power Act and the Defense Production Act to save coal and nuclear power plants. Section 202 of the Federal Power Act has historically been used to address energy supply concerns related to natural disasters or other major energy shortages.
In all fairness, Vesey couldn't tell the future. He didn't know that Texas would be hit with a massive winter storm and a hurricane that led to energy shortages. But the failure wasn't unpredictable. In fact, Ed Hers, as far back as 2013, forecasted that the grid would fail.
With me now, Ed Hers, an energy fellow at the University of Houston. Ed co-wrote this opinion piece. We're going back to 2013. This was for the Houston Chronicle, where he warned of the planning failures of Texas's energy distribution system.
It's not beyond the realm of possibility that lives would have been saved had dispatchable energy been bolstered by the Trump administration. Here's Vesey in conflict with experts on the grid and energy production.
Moreover, it wouldn't do anything to make the electric grid more resilient.
Energy expert Bill Peacock shuts down this thinking.
The reason we had a blackout was because generators invested $66 billion in building out renewable energy plants in Texas over the course of about 15 years. If they had taken that, and the reason they did that was because they were chasing about $22 billion in subsidies for renewable energy. If instead they had invested in natural gas plants and in coal plants, we either wouldn't have had a blackout or it would have just been 30-minute rolling blackout, which is how the system is designed to work.
Where does this leave us? Texas has some control over its destiny when it comes to energy production and transmission, but folks like Congressman Conceit are out to steal that independence. The arguments used to not let the crisis go to waste are fairly easy to debunk. In an emergency, our neighbors will need electricity, and a mistake somewhere else in the system that we don't and can't control might take our grid offline. And nobody should want to give California a veto over our energy production. We're protected from these risks by having our own grid. At the same time Conceit is pushing forced nationalization, his pals in Congress are undermining life-saving efforts to increase reliable energy production. It's no longer a stretch to say these people are playing politics with Texas energy and Texas lives. In the next episode, we'll explore how the Texas grid is vulnerable to attacks by foreign adversaries and what advocates and lawmakers have proposed to protect Texans. We'll also tell you who's standing in the way of these needed reforms. Thank you for listening to this episode of Exposed. We'd like to thank Bill Peacock, Jason Isaac, State Senator Bob Hall, and Congressman Chip Roy for participating in interviews featured in this podcast. For more information on this topic and others facing the state of Texas, please visit texasscorecard.com.
Exposed is a product of Texas Scorecard, the leading source on government and culture in Texas. For more information, go to texasscorecard.com.